context for the rise of Christianity. We will, in this hour, finish up our discussion of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Jewish world, and actually get to discussing the rise of Christianity. So let's return where we were in our lecture by talking about what happens in ancient Greece after the Dark Ages. Do you remember me talking about the Dark Ages in Greek history, but really in Mediterranean history, or the history of the ancient world more broadly, not just for Greek civilization, but the ancient Dark Ages? When were those? Ancient as to differentiate it from the Middle Ages. We're not talking about that, although a Dark Ages of sorts. This is a time when empires unravel. So history unravels. What was causing it? We don't know. The Sea People. Apparently, that's what the Egyptians tell us. Who were the Sea People? Well, they were composed of a group of about a dozen peoples. Herodotus tells us, writing in the middle of the 5th century BC, he tells us that it was the Lydians. Well, that's an empire that none of us have heard about, up in Anatolia, that experiences terrible famine for 18 years. And the king of Lydia, somewhere around the 1200s, dismissed 50% of his people and said, look, we don't have enough food for you. Make ships, take off, and find new places to resettle. That's the ancient theory about who these sea peoples were. And really, we don't have much of a better theory, although it's such an intriguing topic that everybody's got a theory on who these sea people were. The other thing is that it's not just the Lydians, but it's a group of other peoples as well. The Philistines. Almost all archaeologists, almost all biblical historians who were doing archaeology in that time period, oddly enough, are going to concede that the Philistines are among those sea people. People from the people of Palest, come known in biblical times as the sea peoples. The Philistines. Okay, so these Dark Ages ravaged the ancient world from about 1200 BC. And what ends the Dark Ages? Well, Homer. That's why Homer that's why Homer in European civilization, in the history of European civilization, is so doggone important. Because he's the first ancient writer that we have after this huge era of knowing almost nothing. We can reconstruct some things from this ancient Dark Ages based on archaeological records, and it looks pretty bleak. Basically, you see a burn strata of all these ancient civilizations all the way across the Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans in Greece, up through Turkey and the Hittite Empire. You know the word Hittite from, of course, biblical history. Well, they were a powerful empire around this time up in Turkey again, this time to the east of the Lydian Empire, I believe, and coming down into the Levant area a little bit. The Hittite cities are all ravaged. Across Israel, we hear about these Philistines giving all kinds of trouble to the period of the Judges and so on. Down through Egypt. Egypt was the only empire that doesn't actually get overwhelmed by this time period. But you got burned strata all the way across the Mediterranean Sea. But otherwise, no historical records. Homer puts an end to all that. He actually gives us some literature. And the legends that Homer records, thanks to archaeologists that we mentioned last week, like Heinrich Schliemann, who discovered Troy, like Sir Arthur Evans, who discovered the palace at Knossos on Crete. Maybe there was more to those legends than we thought. Maybe it wasn't just all made up, although fanciful it certainly was. Okay, what takes place next in the history of Greek civilization we could call the Archaic period. So we had the Minoan period, we had the Mycenaean period, now we have the Archaic period. The Archaic period, that time period in ancient Greece before we get to the Classical period, the time of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. That's what's going to define the Classical period, the construction of the Parthenon. But before then, the Archaic period. What takes place in the Archaic period? Well, we get Greek colonies. The Olympic Games. Yes, the Olympic Games in 776 BC. One of the more reliable dates for ancient history, or for what immediately comes after ancient history. By the way, this convention of calling this the ancient Dark Ages and what takes place before this period is ancient history. It works pretty well, because what takes place after this in Greek chronology in the Archaic period, we see a rise of these other civilizations that we're aware of as well. The Babylonian Empire, that we recognize from the reading in the prophets of Israel and from the chroniclers and so on, or the Assyrian Empire. These were not the first empires to be based in Assur and Babylon. No, we could call these the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Why? Because we kind of lose track of what happened to them also during this period. Anyway, 776 BC, the Pan-Olympic Games. All of these Greek city-states get together to carry out this sort of a festival, an athletic festival, the Olympic Games, and they've been doing it ever since. Actually, I think the first modern Olympics, and you can check me, I thought was 1929, is that right? Hosted in Athens. So it was an ancient tradition resurrected in the modern era. What's going on in Greece in this time? Well, Greece is colonizing much of the ancient world. It starts really in the 6th century BC, and then in the 5th and 4th centuries you get many more of these colonies. What does a Greek colony look like? In our time frame, when people speak of colonies, you're going to be thinking of colonialism, a European phenomenon, and some would say a North American phenomenon as well. The term gets a little foggy after what takes place in say, the 18th century, 19th century, and even the early part of the 20th century. But be that as it may, what did ancient colonies look like? What were they? Why were they motivated? Well, here's the way I conceive of ancient colonies, these cities that Greece begins to build. They are cities based on the model of the Greek polis that have a mother city, a metropolis. You know that that's the word, that's what metropolis means, a mother city. Now it just means a big city, but etymologically it means a mother city. These colonies are basically city plants from a large established city. And what would motivate that? Well, various things, but mostly people looking for economic opportunity and more land, because there would be a food shortage or there would be a cramped environment. Sometimes it was political infighting, and you'd have a prominent person who decides to found a colony because things didn't go in their favor in a recent election or something like this. So there could be political motivation as well. But largely because the city was getting too big to support itself in that geographical region and for that infrastructure. And so life was becoming less than pleasant, and a group would hive off and go plant a colony. Now, the process of colonization then means that for the ancient Greek world, Greek culture begins expanding far beyond Greece. We have, across that map of the ancient world, we have Greek cities in lots of places. Okay, let me use this map perhaps as a useful way to describe where all these Greek colonies were. Now, this is going to be the empire of Alexander the Great. So when we're talking about Hellenization, you all know what that word means. That means the spread of Greek culture. The illuminated part of the map is the ultimate extent of Alexander the Great's empire. Look at this. He took on the Persians over here. Famously, they were up all the way across eastern modern-day Turkey. Alexander takes on the Persians and just keeps going. It's like this, the Energizer Bunny that just wouldn't quit, and he decides to take all of this conquest through here, motivated by an early conquest of the Persians. The final extent of Alexander the Great's empire just balloons out uncontrollably to the east. But this was not the only extent of the influence of Greek culture. Alexander the Great comes in when? Well, he dies in 332, doesn't he? Or is it 323? I think he dies in check me on it. I think he dies in 323 BC. Anyway, in the late 4th century BC. Now, Greek colonies were being planted 200 and 300 years before that. And where do these Greek colonies go? Well, down here in southern Italy, they called it Great Greece, Magna Grece. Why did they call it that? There were so many Greek polises there. There were so many Greek colonies there that it took on much the feel of Greece, even though it wasn't Greece. They were neighboring with the Latins and the Etruscan people up here further to the north in the 6th century BC. At this time, the Romans weren't really much to speak of. We'll talk about the Romans later, but the Roman Empire doesn't really get going until 3rd, 4th, 5th century BC. So there's not really that much political activity with the Romans in 600 BC when they first start colonizing this area. The Greeks put colonies just tons of colonies down here in southern Italy and Sicily. They put colonies all the way up around the Black Sea. They're Greek cities where Greek would be spoken, Greek customs observed, Greek laws followed, all the way across the Black Sea in the 4th century BC. And all, not entirely across the North African basin coast here, but at least up as far as modern-day Libya, there were Greek colonies. So we think of the process of Hellenization as taking place pretty much purely through Alexander the Great, and certainly he was the largest motivator, or the ultimate spread, I guess we could say. He was the last spread of Greek culture across the Mediterranean world and on into the Asian world as well. But Greek colonies were establishing Greek customs and way of life all across the Mediterranean world centuries before that. Again, what were these colonies like? I don't want you thinking that, like recent colonization, that there was a rigid political relationship between the mother state and the colony. No, these relationships in ancient colonies were much looser. Remember, most of these cities were city-states, so they make their own laws. They're independent. They have legal rights that we would now only associate with nations, right? In antiquity, so there's not a tight legal relationship between the metropolis and the colony, although there would be a reproduction of values, of customs, of language, of business practices. All of that would have been learned in the metropolis and executed in this new location. So that's what's going on in archaic Greece. Now, you've all heard of Marathon. You've all heard of the Battle of Marathon. What was the Battle of Marathon? Last year, I was teaching in Greece with Greg Quiggle's Study Abroad program. I thought the experience in Greece was really stellar. I was teaching in Athens for that program, and we walked along a road just outside the school where there was like this decorative line going down the street, because this was the ancient road where the first marathon runner ran, announcing the victory of the Battle of Marathon. Well, yes, we get that distance of 26 miles and so on, because that's the distance, I believe, from Athens to Marathon. And if I got the story right, a runner, to announce the victory, must have been that he ran from Marathon back to Athens to announce the victory, collapses when he gets there, completely out of breath, and actually dies. And that's the way you'll feel if you ever run a marathon. It's the way I felt just running Spokane's little Bloomsday. But anyway, yes, there was a real battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Why is this such a big turning point? Be right with you, Marcus. Why is this such a big deal? Well, this is when the Athenians finally defeat the Persians. And the Persians, okay, so Marathon is actually just 26 miles north of Athens. So the Persians are on the mainland. The Persians are these ancient enemies of Greece. And just keep that in the back of your mind. Two things important about the Battle of Marathon. Not only afterwards did it open this marvelous period of prosperity for Greece, and this is the beginning really of the classical era then. This is when we have all these grand philosophers, and Athens is becoming a world power, an extraordinarily powerful city-state. This is when the Parthenon is built, and when democracy is established and so on. So this is, Battle of Marathon marks the end of archaic Greece and the beginning of classical Greece. But also, the other important thing about the Battle of Marathon is keep in the back of your mind that when Alexander the Great, a century and a half later, is going to set out to conquer the Persians, these are the old enemies of the Greeks. And look at what Alexander the Great does. Again, almost in some sort of psychotic way. He just can't get enough of trashing these people to the east. He just goes further and further and further and further as long as he has life. Why? He's trying to eradicate their ancient enemy. He's trying to break the back of the Persian Empire once and for all so that they never pester his homeland again. Well, be that as it may, but it's important to understand that background, to understand what in the world is Alexander the Great doing? Why this endless march to the east? He's trying to finally free the Greeks of the threat of Persian invasion. Okay, Marcus, you had a question. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, that's a very good question. Let's see. I'm going to shoot from the hip. I think that those mountains at the northern part of Greece are part of the reason. I think the mountainous areas, if I've got this right, in southern, and I'm piecing this together, Marcus, so some of you do check me on this. The south of Bulgaria, you have these huge mountains, and I think those are going to be the same mountains that run through modern-day Macedonia. Basically, it's a continuation of the Alps. So you can see them on the map here too. And across the entire world, right at that place, I mean, the Alps are connected to the Himalayas and so on. There's this scar across Asia of this, it must have been two, or multiple plates, I have no idea, but there's this scar across the world up there, running all the way from the Pyrenees in Spain, all the way down the Alps through Germany and Switzerland, and ultimately ending up with Mount Everest and so on, that sort of breaks the world in half. And I think that would be part of the reason why the Greeks just didn't have much of a mind about what was beyond those mountains. The mountains are terribly effective land barriers until you develop aircraft. But beyond that, that's a brilliant question. I don't know. Does that mean that the tribal peoples that eventually would participate in the toppling of the Roman Empire, had they not migrated in at this point in time? Many historians will tell us that the fall of the Roman Empire is in some way attached to this migration of the peoples. We have apparently, and I'm not an expert on this, but apparently we have people all from northern Asia pushing the Germans and other tribes into the area during the time period of the 4th and 5th centuries AD, so that the barbarians perhaps were not always there. What we know is in classical historiography as the barbarians, those people to the north of the Roman borders, were not always perhaps there. Maybe there weren't that many people beyond those mountains. I just don't know, Marcus. That's a great question. Go ahead, Chase. That's a really good question. I don't think particularly. I don't think the Persians in the 4th century BC were particularly struggling from some sort of crisis. And at the same time, a lot of this area is not heavily populated. So in the 7th century AD, 7th and 8th century AD, we're going to see a lot of this territory absorbed by the newly founded Muslim empire as well. And that'll be another question. How is it that the Islamic empire can take over such an enormous space so quickly? It doesn't seem to have been very heavily populated. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, fine. Battle of Marathon, terribly important for the way that it ushered in the classical period. The Peloponnesian Wars finally erupt in 431 BC, and this classical period is going to be a short-lived period of glory. From 490 BC to 431 BC, everything's really peachy for the Greeks, and this is the time of the peak of philosophy, with the Platonic school a little bit before that, and Aristotle's school and so on. This is also a terribly important time for architecture in Athens. We have the construction of the Parthenon, and so on. With the Peloponnesian Wars in 431, we have this, I suppose it looks to us like infighting, but this war between these two city-states, Athens and Sparta, and that ultimately is going to drain a lot of resources and weaken Athens. So this is going to be bringing the classical age already to a close pretty quickly. I don't know when you want to truly close the classical age. Might as well run it up to Alexander the Great or something like that. But already with the Peloponnesian War, there's this weakening that's taking place. Thucydides, that's Thucydides. Thucydides is the person to go to if you're interested in learning more about the history of the Peloponnesian Wars. He gives tons of information about that. And then lastly, we have Alexander the Great, who comes to power in 356 BC. No, that's when he's born, excuse me. And he comes to power in 332 BC. He dies in 323 BC. And this is going to be sort of the high watermark of Hellenization around the world. Okay. So, do you have any questions about the Greek world? Yep, go ahead, Keith. Sure. Yep. Sorry we don't have Pete with us today. Pete was a really great addition to this class. Because we're running 2 broadcasts this semester, we just ran out of human power to make everything happen that we wanted to. So we had to turn off the lights. I'm so sorry. It wasn't enough juice. Pete is not with us for the rest of this semester. He is going to be working on this class, but in another capacity. So we don't have the notes being taken automatically as it would have been really wonderful to have. Sorry for that. The dates for Alexander the Great were, he takes over his father's empire in 356 BC, and he dies in 323 BC. Okay, go ahead, please. Right. Okay, so he dies when he's 32, so you do the math. I think he was born in 356, is that right? 356 about. But I think an interesting question there, too, is what does his father's empire look like? So suddenly we have Alexander the Great coming on the scene, and we haven't talked of empires before. We've talked of city-states. So what's new with Alexander the Great? Right. Alexander the Great's father, Philip of Macedon, was a general, Macedon being this mountainous region up to the north of Greece that's still to this day not recognized by Greece as an independent state, but the Macedonians, I think the UN does recognize it as a country of about 2 million people. Philip of Macedon is a general of one of these city-states and sort of links together a number of these city-states in what we could call hegemony. What's hegemony? What's hegemony? For those of you who've studied Greek, it comes from the Greek word hegemai, which means to be a leader. Hegemony. It's a form of political alliance that's purposely vague. So after World War II, political theorists and political scientists would speak of American hegemony. What do they mean by that? Well, they mean that in an undefined way, America had a leading role in world politics, but the term itself is purposely vague. So Philip of Macedon brings this sort of vague union to a number of these city-states. His son Alexander the Great, when he's out fighting in battle, when Philip of Macedon dies, when Philip of Macedon dies, he takes over his father's army, and then we really get the beginnings of an empire. It's a continuation of this model of hegemony, but it becomes much more rigid because the land becomes so much more large. It's the best I can do. Go ahead, Travis. Right? I'm sorry. Elliot, go ahead, please. Philip of Macedon? Or no? Thucydides. Yep. Historian from the 5th century who documents the Peloponnesian Wars. Thucydides. Great. Let me talk to you a little bit about Greek art, because while I am not an expert in it and will struggle to speak articulately about it and compellingly about it, it's still worth your time. Why? Greek art, or art from any ancient civilization, is going to, if it's well enough preserved to be experienced, anything like the original was experienced, is an amazing way to get to understand the aspirations, the achievements of an ancient people. And look at some of this art with me, if you would, just to get a taste of what ancient civilization was like. I'm going to take you through a couple pieces here, and I'm going to show you a little video as well. Let's just talk about ancient art in the Greek and Roman world. Here we have, let me just give you a couple pieces. Here we have this is up on the Parthenon, but I want to get exactly the title for you. This is up on the Parthenon. This is Crumb. Oh, brother. Well, it's the Erechtheion on the top of the Parthenon, but I've lost my other information about when it was built and so on. The Parthenon generally is that huge temple atop of the Acropolis. Hey, Palmer, can you take us there in Google Earth? That would be super. Book us a ticket to the Parthenon, please. The Parthenon, built atop of the Acropolis in ancient Greece, it was built in antiquity after the in this prosperous time in the classical period after the Battle of Marathon. It was huge, absolutely huge. I think at the time of its building, it was one of the very largest buildings on Earth. Oh, great, and I've lost all of my information about it. I'm so sorry. Anyway, let me tell you what I do know about it. It's built atop of the Acropolis. Do you know what the Acropolis is? What the word Acropolis means? It means high city. You're going to find, if you tour Europe, you're going to find that many of these cities that were built and flourished during medieval times in Europe are built along rivers, right? Water systems are going to be the important thing for where to plot a city in medieval Europe. Where do you put a city in the ancient world, specifically the ancient Greek world? What geographical feature attracts a city? An acropolis. What's an acropolis? A high hill where everybody can run in a time of attack. That is the geographical feature that you're going to find. Can you give us a view just to show us how elevated this is? This is marvelous. In Corinth, too, and some of these other ancient Greek cities, you're going to find that there's this hill shape, which is going to really be the central feature on any ancient Greek city. This is the Erechtheion, I think, built in the 6th century BC. So the Erechtheion, I believe, is the older part of the Parthenon. The Parthenon, that large temple to Aphrodite, well, to a whole bunch of the gods. Yes, to Aphrodite. Parthenon means temple to the Virgin. There you can see it. Is going to be built later in the 5th century. This is from Delphi. This is one of the best preserved ancient pieces of art. It's the Charioteer of Delphi, cast in 476 BC. This is the 5th century BC. And look at the intricacy of the statue. Isn't this amazing? It's meant to commemorate the victory of one of the charioteer teams at the Pythian Games. It's considered to be one of the very best, finest examples of bronze sculpture in antiquity. Look at that. Look at the detail. Whoops. Look at the detail. Look at the ruffles in the charioteer's garment. Look at the curls coming out from underneath the charioteer's cap. Can you see that? It's just an amazing technical achievement. Look at the reins. I mean, they even sculpted in bronze reins for this charioteer to be holding. This is in Delphi, where it was discovered. What's famous about Delphi? The oracle at Delphi, right? What is this business about the oracle at Delphi? Well, Delphi does become an incredibly renowned space in ancient Greece for this oracle there. I heard a historian an ancient historian of classical antiquity explain the phenomenon of the oracle this way. The historian who explained it was not a religious person, or certainly would not have acknowledged spiritual realities, I don't think. So, but he had a wonderful, perfectly perfectly simple explanation for what was this attraction to Delphi. His theory ran as follows: precisely because, now I don't know why in the first place it became such a phenomenon, but once it had already achieved some status, says this historian, it became a connecting point for people from all different walks of life. And so as people would come to the oracle and ask questions of the oracle, for example, somebody who had a political feud and they were thinking about starting a colony, and they come to the Delphi to get to the gods to speak of whether this is going to be a fortuitous venture or not, comes and speaks down and talks to the priests. Shall I go build this place? And the priests perhaps take out this man for a pint at the local bar, and they talk through all of the other details about what's going on in this part of the world and so on. And perhaps because the religious people, the priests who were sort of working this show at Delphi, had so many of these conversations, it becomes an ancient form of the internet. Haha. An ancient point of communication where all of this human data is gathering. And so the priest perhaps would be in a good position to say, aha, well, 2 months ago I spoke to another person who was starting a colony out in this area, and things went terribly for him because there's this terrible pack of, some sort of animal or something like that that's making life so difficult. Or there was much less rain. This year was a terrible year for rains in this or that section of the world. Anyway, because Delphi became such a hub, and people would travel such incredible distances to get there and exchange information, perhaps it did take on some sort of oracular role in the distribution of information in classical antiquity. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting theory worth a moment of our time to consider. Okay, let me tell you something about, or let you observe something about ancient Greek music. I found this video on YouTube and thought it was brilliant. We have this man here who's reconstructed his own instrument of the type of lyre that they would have used in ancient Greek, and he's going to play for us the Psychelos epitaph. Isn't this wonderful? This is perhaps the oldest complete piece of music in world history. It was discovered by Sir William Mitchell Ramsay in 1883 on a tombstone. We have the text and the music both. The text reads, it's for a man who's mourning his wife, whom he's lost. And this deceased wife, Euterpe, is her name, and the man who's writing this epitaph says, these are the words, "While you live, shine. Don't suffer anything at all. Life exists only for a short while, and time demands its toll." And I want to take a minute and a half of your time to let you listen to a reconstruction of the oldest piece of music in world history. Here are the credits. So it's Michael Levy who's going to play this for us. A lovely piece, and you can see some of the technique that you could exercise on an instrument like this. You have an idea for the type of music that it could produce, and that is the oldest piece of music that we have, produced somewhere in the 200 to 100 BC era. We also have the Delphic hymns, which I won't play for you, but also discovered in about a century ago in 1893 by a French archaeologist. It dates with precision to 1228 BC, composed for these Pythian games. And you can look those up on your own time too if you want to hear another sample of this very, very old Greek music, but sort of brings you into the spirit of the time, I think. Marcus, go ahead. That is a good question. And I'm not a musicologist, so I'm going to really give you a loose answer, Marcus. But what I understand is that it was a more or less unique but clear notation scheme, so that there's consensus on the interpretation, the musical interpretation of that scale that they present there. And beyond that, I don't know. I just know that there's not a whole lot of discrepancy on how people interpret this piece. It's more or less universally regarded as the oldest piece of music in the world. Now there are fragmentary pieces of music before then. The Hurrian songs, for example, from Chinese music are largely complete, but this piece from Greece has the distinction of being complete. Okay. We're going to break in just a moment here too, but I want to close our time. Again, I want to take just a moment or two to look at artistic pieces, give you some visual and auditory information about this time period so that you can sort of get into the spirit of it. And I think one of the best ways to do this too is to play a short reconstruction. It's a video reconstruction of ancient Rome. So we're going to travel to ancient Rome here for the next 5 minutes. It's a 5-minute piece. It's called... You can look up this project in the internet if you want. Professor Bernie Fisher at the University of Virginia is the researcher who's been leading this project. I will play the credits. As soon as the credits roll, you are dismissed for this hour, and then we'll take another 10 minutes break here. But as the credits roll, you'll see lots and lots of names mentioned. They put together tons of archaeological reports to actually recreate this computer-generated model. So I'm very excited for what they're able to do. And I noticed just this last week, Professor Fisher posted this. Just 1 week ago, folks. Dear viewers, thank you for all your likes and positive comments. The video is based on a 3D model of ancient Rome in the year 320 AD. The project continues to make progress towards its ultimate goal, which is a complete 3D model of the city that can be run interactively in a game engine and viewed on a normal computer monitor or a special immersive device such as the Oculus Rift. Yes! We're always interested in obtaining more support, so on and so on. Yeah, they're building a time machine. They are. This is going to be incredible. It's a time machine that doesn't transport you back into antiquity. It transports antiquity in an interactive, immersive environment to you now. So, but for our purposes in this class, the point of this video is just get a feel for the expanse of the city. Even if you've been to Rome, all that's preserved of the ancient city is this tiny little central area. And you look at the Colosseum, and the Colosseum is an impressive structure today, but it's been pillaged and vandalized for 2,000 years. It's full of pockmarks. You know, they've been pulling the iron out of that structure for a long time. It's a ruin. It looks nothing as impressive as it would have looked in antiquity. Even the most pillaged ruins are impressive to us today. What would Rome have looked like in its glory day, when everything's covered in marble and the streets are actually full of people? People are holding out commerce. What would the city have actually looked like? Well, it would have been an enormously impressive city, even to those of you who have visited big cities today. I know that your standards are high and skyscrapers are an amazing achievement of modernity and so on. This wouldn't have been an impressive city to any of us. This video just gives you a feel for what it might have looked like. Great. So I hope that just gave you an impression of how large the city was. It's a unique city in the Roman Empire. It's by far the largest city, but an amazing example of what was possible in antiquity. I do look forward to the day when this is released for the Oculus Rift, so we can send you to the library as a homework assignment. Go through the ancient city of Rome and take these, or take your camera and take a picture of these sites. You know, sort of a treasure hunt, something like that. And then on your spare time, you could shoot up zombies around ancient Rome. Wouldn't that be great? You're dismissed here for, this is going to be the only break that we take actually this morning, so I'll put up on the timer for 15 minutes. You can always peek to see when you're due back, and we'll begin with an in-class quiz, so make sure that you're ready to take that quiz when the timer goes off in 15 minutes. Thanks. All right, class, I know you hate that sound, but it's time to begin your quiz. Over to Palmer, who will administer your quiz. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, does everybody want to get into Blackboard? So by way of preface, I have changed the quiz so that it should be mobile compatible. It works perfect, okay. The only difference that you'll see probably on your computers is that you'll be able to see all of the questions at once, I think. And so you'll just have to keep track of question 1 and make sure that you're putting the answer in the right place. But this should go a lot smoother. Let me know if it doesn't. So is everyone ready to go? Nope, nope. Should be the only one available, quiz 1. I see some people ready to go, waiting patiently. Okay, I'm going to start with the first question. What marks the end of the ancient Dark Ages? A. Herodotus. B. The Roman Republic. C. Alexander the Great. D. The Battle of Marathon. Or E. Homer. Can I get hands for whoever is not in Blackboard yet? So there's still a few of you. Is it just loading? Is it just taking a long time to load? Okay. Can I just have you guys write down the answer to this question so that we can keep going through this? Is that okay? Okay. Question 2. Which 2 city-states were the primary rivals in the Peloponnesian Wars? A. Athens and Ephesus. B. Troy and Sparta. C. Mycenae and Troy. D. Athens and Sparta. Or E. Troy and Ur. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, next question. What is the name of the oldest complete musical piece known in history? Is it A, the Delphic Hymns, B, Amazing Grace, C, the Hurrian Songs, D, Kyrie eleison, or E, the Seikilos Epitaph? Okay, next question. And this one, these last 2 are going to be, sorry, I should have told you this before. These last 2 are going to be from the last lecture, last week, because we did not take quiz 2. So these last 2 are from then. What is the link between Egyptian civilization and the Minoan civilization? Is it A, hieroglyphics and linear A? B, there is no link? C, King Minos came from Egypt? D, they both worshipped bulls? Or E, the Minoan civilization defeated the Egyptians? And moving on to the next question. According to the lecture, which of the following definitions best describes what the term prehistory refers to? Is it A, the story of human civilization before written records? B, the story of human civilization before Christ's incarnation? C, the time before the world was created? D, the story of human civilization after cities emerge? Or E, a period of time about which we know nothing? Okay.
Great.
That's it.
Thanks, Palmer. All right, so welcome back to the second part of our lecture today. We will now trace out the expansion of Christianity. We've talked enough about the context for the beginning of Christianity. Let's talk about the expansion of Christianity. How and why and when did Christianity grow in this world that we've taken some time to describe and set? So we'll be talking for the remainder of our time today about the expansion of Christianity. There's a Peanuts cartoon that caught my eye a little bit ago when I was first preparing this lecture. It was a Peanuts cartoon in which Charlie Brown comes up to Sally, who is busily typing at her desk, and Charlie Brown says, "What are you doing? What are you writing?" An essay on church history, says Lucy. She reads then the first part of her essay aloud. "When writing church history, we have to go back to the very beginning, period. Our pastor was born in 1930. Right? Where does, as we describe the spread of Christianity, when Christianity first explodes, if you will, in this explosive expansion, I should say, as it grows in this ancient world that we've described, where does it grow and why? What does that expansion look like? Here are some of the fast facts that we need to sort of frame out the discussion. It's in 313 that Emperor Constantine issues the Edict of Milan. And after this time, Christianity is a licit religion. It's a legal religion. It's among those permitted and tolerated within the Roman Empire. Rome is no longer going to be a persecuting agent to Christianity after 313 and the Edict of Milan. In 380, some years later, Christianity is going to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Those are two separate dates. We've got Christianity becoming legalized. It is a legal option in 313. It's the official religion of the Roman Empire in 380 AD. How did Christianity come to be absorbed into an empire that in the early days, in fact, right up until the threshold of Constantine's coming, had been such a persecutor of Christianity? And once Christianity makes this transfer onto Roman civilization, and once the Roman world becomes this officially Christian empire, that's going to set the stage then for the rest of this two-class sequence on Christianity and Western culture 1 and 2. How did Rome become Christianized? What was motivating that? Well, there's a very interesting book that was written a couple years ago by Rodney Stark. And Rodney Stark takes on this question: why did Rome convert to Christianity? What about the conversion of Rome? How did it happen? Rodney Stark is really an American sociologist. He's not a historian per se, but he's taken on a number of very interesting historical questions. And he explicitly denies expertise either as a church historian or as a New Testament scholar, but he's taken on this very fascinating question about the rise of Christianity, and he's written it up in a fascinating little book, The Rise of Christianity. And the subtitle says it all: How the Obscure, Marginal Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. What's Stark's analysis? Well, Rodney Stark sort of turns the question on its head. He doesn't ask, how fast does Christianity grow, and try to piece that together from historical records as the historians of ancient Christianity are doing. He, as a sociologist, comes to the problem with a whole different set of tactics and tools and turns the question on its head. He asks the question this way: if we say that there are perhaps 60 million people in the Roman Empire at its height in the 4th century. And if we say that let's begin this quest by assuming that Constantine, whatever his true religious convictions have been, and they're quite obscure and inapproachable to us now, but whatever they may have been, let's say that Constantine chose to convert to Christianity based on political expediency. Let's say he thought it would win him with favor with the majority of Roman citizens. So let's say there are at least 30 million Christians in Rome by the time of Constantine's conversion. How fast does Christianity have to grow from 30 AD to 313 AD to become a majority religion in Rome? How could that have happened numerically, says Rodney Stark. And I've taken this very helpful little table from his book. You can see he gives us at the very beginning of the book on page 7, and there's the bibliographical information for the text. Here's what Rodney Stark says. He says, let's start in the year 40 AD and say there were 1,000 Christians. Let's just put those numbers down as a working hypothesis. Now, if there were 60 million people in the empire, what percentage of the population would these 1,000 Christians represent? Well, they would in fact make only 0.0017% of the population. It would be a minuscule part of the population. No one would know a Christian in 40 AD. They would basically be an entirely unknown demographic within the empire. Rodney Stark continues developing his theory. He says, let's say that every decade, here's the growth rate, every decade the Christian population grows by 40%. And his thesis is based on real numbers. He, being a sociologist, has done his math here. He looks at the growth rate, for example, of the Mormon church over the last century, and they have about that same growth rate, about 40% every decade. So then he starts crunching numbers. What, at that growth rate, would the growth of Christianity look like? Look, in 50 AD, if we multiply 1,000 by 1.4 to show a growth of 40%, you'd have 1,400 Christians, and that would still make up an almost unspeakably small percentage of the population. That'd be 0.0023. At this same growth rate, by 100 AD, there would be 7,500 Christians, or 7,500, and that would still not even be close to being a percentage. That's 1/100th of a percentage of the entire population. By 150, you'd have 40,000 Christians. Okay, now we're getting to, there's at least a body of Christians there. By 200 AD, you'd have 200,000 Christians, 217,000 Christians. By 250, you'd have 1,171,000 Christians, and that would be nearly 2% of the population. That'd be 1.9% of the population. At that point, people would start perhaps to have heard of Christians, perhaps to have known Christians. You almost need, like, for a demographic to be known by people, you got to have at least 2% of the population, just so that people know your demographic. And maybe that would have occurred for the Christian community within the Roman Empire in about 250 AD. By 300 AD, there you have over 6 million Christians. Look at that jump from 250 to 300. You'd have this massive, apparently massive jump from almost 2% of the population to over 10% of the population. And if you maintain the same growth rate, by 350, you'd have over 30 million Christians. So, Rodney Stark says, the conversion of Rome, if you will, is not some sort of miraculous event. We need not anticipate that Constantine sees this vision in the sky of the Chi-Rho, this cross. The Chi-Rho being it's a conflation of the two characters of the Greek alphabet that are the first two characters of the word Christ. Chi-Rho. Legend has it, actually it's reported by Eusebius, but everybody nowadays thinks it can't possibly have any historical validity to it. Constantine sees this apparition in the sky. He believes that God is telling him to conquer in this sign. As Eusebius reports, Constantine puts that on his banners and shields, and Constantine wins this terrible battle against Maxentius. this tyrannical fellow who's persecuting the Christians in Rome at the time, at the Milvian Bridge just north of Rome. Hey, can you take us there, Palmer? Can you take us to the Milvian Bridge just to see where that is on the Roman map, just north of Rome? And after that famous success in 312, the year later, Constantine issues this Edict of Milan, which declares that Christianity is a legal religion. Now, Rodney Stark's theory has a lot going for it. Excuse me. Although we historians of early Christianity have very few numbers to work with, few actual statistics to work with, a number of the estimates that have been previously issued by well-respected historians sort of match up with what Rodney Stark predicts the Christian population would be. For example, Robert Wilkin estimated that there were about 50,000 Christians in the middle of the 2nd century, or just under 50,000 Christians in the middle of the 2nd century. So what would that have looked like? In the middle of the 2nd century, about 150 AD, we've got 40,000 Christians according to Stark's analysis. So that seems to match up pretty well. We have Robert Grant, famous church historian from the University of Chicago, saying that there might have been about 7,000 Christians in Rome at the end of the 2nd century. 7,000 Christians in Rome, or 1% of the Roman population. So there's about 600,000 people in the city of Rome, and Robert Grant says that around 200 AD there would have been 7,000 Christians in Rome, so just a little over 1%. You know, it's not a total verification, but you can see here that in 200, Rodney Stark predicts that there would be about 1/3% of Christians throughout the Roman Empire. Rome would have been an especially a place that had been especially impacted by the growth of Christianity. We know that from the Epistle to the Romans, and also because it was a metropolitan area, we assume that news of Christianity would have moved to the Jewish community there at an early date, and so on. So anyway, Stark's thesis seems to have this unusual affirmation from these hypotheses that have been previously issued by other church historians. Let me just present that theory to you as a very interesting discussion of the growth of Christianity. I find it fascinating. Of course, Rodney Stark is bringing a set of analytical tools that cannot be expected to be verified because we just don't have the data to work with in ancient history, but very interesting hypothesis. Let me also suggest that it's not the way that Luke describes the spread of Christianity in his account in the book of Acts, but I'll leave it to you to resolve once and for all this debate between Rodney Stark and apparently between Luke's account. But let me present Luke's account as an opposing opinion. And we touched on this last week, how does Luke describe the growth of Christianity in his account in in his account in Acts? Go ahead. Elliot, go ahead. Yeah. How about 7 weeks? Oh, go ahead, Elliot. Yeah. Good. In fact, doesn't even Luke use that as a literary device as he's going through his account in Acts as a summary section? You'll find a number of these sections. It'll be the Lord added numbers daily, or there were 3,000 converted at this sermon, etc. That Luke will use that as a literary device. We're done with this section of geographical section. We're done talking about Ephesus or Samaria or whatever. We're going to move on now, so let me tell you how many were converted. And Luke is very optimistic in his reports. A lot of people are getting saved and becoming Christians according to Luke's account. The most dramatic of those presentations comes in Luke 2, verses 9 through 11, and we read them last week, where Luke records all of the people from the various communities that were in Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the resurrection, or thereabout. And these, in the large and bold and black titles you can see, are the places where he's talking about. Luke will say that there are, less than 2 months after the resurrection, there are newly planted Christian communities in all of these regions. Basically, he's describing all of the eastern portion of the Roman Empire and all of the western portion of the Parthian Empire. He's talking about very large physical spaces here in his depiction there. Now, if we're going, I'm just going to present Luke's account on the one hand and Rodney Stark's account on the other hand, and I'm not going to try to arbitrate them, but I will try to fill in the details as we have them, as we talk about the growth of Christianity. How did it work? Where did it come from? Was it explosive, as Luke says? Was it gradual, incremental, as Rodney Stark hypothesizes? What do we have on that we can actually describe this growth of Christianity in a concrete way? Well, there are some passages that we can turn to. Probably most famous among them is Tacitus's depiction of the Nerorian persecution. What's that? Tacitus, the famous Roman historian, is describing the persecution under Nero. Now, in Christian terminology, that's the Nerorian persecution, because we're in our minds are thinking about the Christian population there. Tacitus does not, of course, use those words. He's not focused especially on the Christian population, but he is talking about Nero's misdeeds and his inhumane treatment of these people, and he is talking about his building projects and the Great Fire of Rome. What happened? Well, near the end of Nero's reign, Nero reigned until 68 AD, and in 64 in 64 AD, Nero apparently had his men light fire to the city. That's the account that we received from Tacitus himself and from Suetonius. But of course, there was speculation about who actually started the fire, where did it actually come from, and no one could really trace that. But rumor had it, and these ancient historians were inclined to believe that Nero had actually had his men set part of the city ablaze. And part of what really disgusted the Roman population was there's this, in 64 AD, there's this big fire, it burns out a big area in the oldest part of Rome, and wouldn't you know it, Nero, right after this fire destroys a lot of the city, tears down the rubble and builds this huge pond and garden right where that fire occurred. So people were starting to put two and two together and saying, you know what, Nero set fire because he wanted the land for his palace. He was expanding his palace. So the people were quite disgusted. Now, where did that actually take place? Well, where the Colosseum is today. In an attempt to actually regain the support of the Roman people, let's see, was that Titus? No, it's Vespasian, excuse me. Vespasian, the first Flavian ruler, so we have a change in dynasty at this time. Nero is done. He's the last of his dynasty. We have the new dynasty coming in of Roman emperors. We have the Flavian dynasty coming in. And Vespasian, in order to try to win back the people, builds what was then called the Flavian Amphitheater, or known to us as the Colosseum, on that spot where Nero had this huge pond. So this was a terrible scar on the city and a terrible offense to the people. Anyway, Nero, in order to try to cover himself, blames the Christians for this fire that breaks out in 64 AD. And Tacitus describes how Nero has blamed the Christians, and he starts killing the Christians in a way to try to regain credibility with the people. The plan kind of backfires. Of course, the Christians see Nero to be this terrible villain, and even those who had no interest in Christianity start wondering about Nero's humaneness. It's gruesome what unfolds. And so Nero loses a lot of ground with his own people too. Here's what Tacitus says of that persecution. First then, those who confessed, i.e. those who confessed to be Christians, were arrested. Then on their report, a huge multitude was convicted. Public torments were added to their death. They were covered with the skins of wild beasts and torn to death by dog, or fastened to crosses, and when daylight failed, burned to serve as light by night. So Nero, in an act of unspeakable cruelty, would light people up on posts and use them as human torches to illuminate his garden. Now, this is one of the very few records that we have that does tell us something about the expansion of Christianity. What can you deduce from this text that would help fill in the details between Luke the Evangelist's account and Rodney Stark's reconstruction? What can we add to that picture? Go ahead, Elliot. according to Tacitus's account, we're speaking of a huge multitude. Now, I don't know what you need to have a huge multitude, but this is 64 AD. So Stark's mathematical reconstruction, to my ears, sounds like it needs amendment, just because predicted there would be somewhere around 2,000 Christians at this point in the whole empire. And in Rome, particularly as a city, of course, many fewer than that. So, good. There's a huge multitude involved. Go ahead and remind me of your name one more time, please. Thanks, Braden. Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting idea too. So Braden's hypothesis was perhaps Tacitus does not lessen the credibility of Rodney Stark's hypothesis. If a huge multitude were killed, perhaps that actually set the population back. So maybe there only were a couple thousand left in the empire. Interesting idea. What can we deduce from Tacitus's paragraph that would speak to this question of how and when Christianity spread throughout the empire? Good point, Braden. I'll just let that stand. Okay, go ahead, Keith. Tell me more, Keith, when Christians were arrested? Yeah, so we learned something of the actual process by which this took place. Yep, we've got this initial crowd being questioned, presumably, and confessing, and then the soldiers must have been asking them, okay, give me all your email contacts, etc. Give me all your connections, and who else do you know in this Christian community? Right. Yeah. Romans didn't have Facebook, praise God. It's not really funny. Misty. Interesting. Misty's giving us the idea that Christianity may have been perceived as a political threat. That's a very interesting question. And because at various times in the history of the Roman Empire and then in the broader history of Christian history, Christianity is often perceived as a political threat. That's a reoccurring part of the Christian history, which usually befuddles Christians but seems to make sense to those who see Christianity only from the outside. For whatever reason, large groups of people getting together, having meetings, disturbs those politicians who are unsettled about their own power. Be that as it may. That's a very interesting question there, Misty. I would gently propose that that's probably not the case in Nero's situation. At least from the records that we get from Tacitus and Suetonius, Nero seems to have been sort of an unbalanced chap. Actually, not terribly interested in politics. He saw himself as this great artist, this opera singer. Remember when he commits suicide? Oh, what a great artist has died. He actually took surprisingly little interest in the management of what he was of the empire and what he was doing. So it looks like he just saw the Christians as a convenient scapegoat rather than a political threat to his ambitions and what he's trying to do. But given the larger story, that's a very good point, Misty. Anything else that we can derive from this? I would, yep, somebody, go ahead, Kevin. Tell me more about what that would look like. So, yes. Oh, Good. Kevin's observation is perhaps this persecution too helped scatter Christians. And actually, no doubt it did. Yeah, that's a consistent theme as well. When persecution hits, it seems to just disperse the movement. Nicely done. I think we could derive a couple of factoids from this little bit from Tacitus. We can say that in 64 AD, which is a pretty early date, the resurrection happened perhaps 30 AD, something like that, given that Jesus was about, so traditionally biblical scholars give us 33, and he's born in 4 BC or what have you, so perhaps around 30 AD is the starting point for the church. 64 AD, we're only 3.5 decades into this show, and already in Rome, as far away as Rome, we've got a huge multitude. This is an early date, and we're speaking of a significant distance. Rome is a long way away from Jerusalem. So these are some of the facts that emerge from this little snippet of history. Good. Can I read for you one other little paragraph that comes to us from Roman literature that gives us an interesting idea of the growth of Christianity at this early period? This comes from Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger is an imperial governor of the Roman province of Pontus and Bithynia in modern-day northern Turkey on the Black Sea. He writes a letter to Emperor Trajan in about 112 AD, asking about the imperial policy on how Christians should be persecuted or what was the penalty for being a Christian and so on. Pliny the Younger, you get the idea, he's this provincial governor. He's in this backwater space in the Roman Empire. It's the early decades of the second decade of the 2nd century AD, and he's met Christians now. He feels that he should do something about this Christian movement, and he just doesn't know what. So he writes Rome to get official orders on how to deal with Christians. Here's what he says. I have never attended examinations of Christians, and therefore I do not know what and how far it is customary to investigate or to punish. Meanwhile, I have followed this procedure in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians. I asked them if they were Christians. If they confessed, I ask a second and a third time, threatening with punishment. I ordered those who persevered to be led away. And the document continues. Therefore, suspending the investigation, I hasten to consult you. It seemed to me a matter worthy of consultation, especially for the number endangered. For many of every age and every rank, and even of both sexes, are called into danger and will be called. The contagion of this superstition, and there, of course, Pliny the Younger is speaking of Christianity. The contagion of this superstition was spread not only through towns, but also villages and even rural areas. This takes place in about 112 AD, give or take, just a hair. What can we learn? What does this document tell us about the development of Christianity or the spread of Christianity? Okay, one more time. I do want to learn your name, but I'm afraid. Yarek. It's not so bad. I can do that. Thanks, Yarek. I was afraid I'd fail. Good. Look at that. Nicely done. Nicely done, Yarek. So, right. Look at Pliny the Younger's point is if I start persecuting Christians, if I start enacting political penalties on those who confess to be Christians, that is going to take not just all day or all week, this is going to take forever. We're talking about both sexes, we're talking about in the towns and in the rural areas, we're talking about people of every rank, we're talking about people of every age. This is shot through every demographic that Pliny the Younger cares to mention. So, good. Christianity is within every strata of society. Nice observation. Who else? I can't see you, so just call it out. Somebody else have an observation? What else can we learn from this passage, this text? Go ahead, Chase. I'm sympathetic to that view. Chase has said that they didn't perhaps understand what Christianity was. I'm sympathetic to that view. Tell me what the indications would be. Okay, right. We see that in Pliny the Younger's hesitation. He confesses that he's not seen investigations, and apparently he doesn't have any experience or experiential contact with Christians, although he knows that this is a large group that he's talking about. Good. But he seems, the whole process seems rather mysterious to him experientially. Fine. Malachi, right? Mike, I'm sorry. That could be, yes. So Micah's point is, could Christianity have been recent in the area, given what Chase is also saying? Yes, I'll put that down. Christianity may have been a recent arrival. What else can we learn from this text? Anything else? Marcus. Good, good. He disdains it. Yep. And so he calls it a superstition. Fine. And Nick, I saw your hand up as well. That's the last point that I was hoping somebody would mention. What is that, Nick? Good. So Nick is saying that Christianity has spread through not only towns, but also rural areas and so on. Fine. And I would want to add to that, Nick, that the geographical observation that I was hoping somebody would make is that this is way out in Pontus. This is in the backwater of the Roman Empire. So if ideas travel first to hubs, we can presume that Christianity is in a lot of other places as well, given that this is a backwater in the Roman Empire. Sort of the last place you'd expect a new idea to arrive. Okay, great. Thanks for working through those passages with me. These are two of the early passages that tell us, from Roman history, that tell us something about the spread of Christianity. Now, why did Christianity spread? We've looked at some data that whatever picture we reconstruct, whether it be Luke's, whether it be Rodney Stark's, whether it be a hybrid of the two, or as we fill in the details from Pliny the Younger and also from Tacitus, Christianity was spreading rapidly. It was spreading at a pace, and in the 4th century it's going to be a majority religion, a dominant religion in the Roman Empire. Why did it spread? Let's get to the why question. I was amazed when I visited Africa for the first time. I was with my wife there in 2010. I've probably told you before that she was raised as a missionary child in Tanzania. We were going back to visit Tanzania and Kenya. And when I went to Africa for the first time, I was amazed that we couldn't get out of reach of cell phone coverage or away from Coca-Cola. That to me was amazing. I just could not believe how these bits of world culture were in places that I would have previously thought to be absolutely impenetrable. I remember we were traveling to the Masai Mara. So my wife had a missionary friend who was working among the Maasai people. That's an Aboriginal people in Kenya. So we were going out to this, what I understood to be this very primitive space. We were in Nairobi. Now Nairobi is a world metropolitan area. It's quite built up and relatively modern. But we were driving for hours and hours north of Nairobi, and we just got into some of the bumpiest roads that I had ever gone down. We were trying to pass this one other car. We happened to be awesome in a Land Rover. It was working fine. The car opposed to us was coming along, and both cars swerved. This car goes in the ditch like this. Oh no, what do we do? I'd never been in this situation. We all dogpile out of the cars, look around, and everybody else seems to know what you do. You get around the car and pick it up. I didn't know that. So they just pull this car up. Everybody gets together. You got about 8 people. It works. Pull this car up, put it back on the road. Fine. It was a light little car. And they drive on. we're going through hours and hours of these roads that I can't actually believe that we're doing it. It's like, these are the roughest roads I've seen. Okay, that night we get up to this little village, and like a series of huts, literally, with a 4-foot roof like this, and everybody's crouched down to get in. And there's no smokestack to this little hut, so the person in there cooking, there's all kinds of smoke in the hut. So it's like, wow, what's this? A real African hut. I step in, my eyes. Tourist! Anyway, it seemed to me to be pretty primitive. When we got there, they had slit this throat of this goat, and they were just like pulling everything out of the entrails of the goat when we arrived there. And it's like, sweet, we're going to be eating that tonight. Anyway, as we were sitting around that night, and Linda had told me, yeah, they're going to drink the blood of this goat afterwards, but it's a very special thing, so you won't be invited to do it. Fine. So that night, as we're gathered around the fire, and there's not lights in any direction as far as anybody can see. It's like, you and the stars, and that's it. And there we are, and we're eating our dinner. It's already dark because it's close to the equator and the sun goes down pretty early. And I can't see anything that I'm eating, and I'm just thinking about that bucket of blood that they were going to drink later, just hoping that that didn't make it into my bowl of soup. And then, whoosh, ding, out our friend, this Maasai person, pulls out his cell phone and takes a call. It's like, what? Anyway, this is a first impression that I had of Africa. I couldn't believe that you could not get out of range of cell phones or the other thing that struck me as omnipresent, besides God, but right up there with God, was Coca-Cola. Why is it that you could go to the most remote place in the world and the man or the woman there would offer you a cup of Coca-Cola when you arrived? Well, if we were to speak of the growth of Christianity as, say, analogous to the spread of Coca-Cola, we could describe the spread of Coca-Cola in terms of like, where did it start and what were the distribution channels. We could talk about how they actually have local factories in these countries and so on, and how they recycle bottles. We could talk about the mechanics of how Coca-Cola is distributed. But let's turn the question a little bit and ask, why is Coca-Cola drunk everywhere? Okay? What's the sweetness, to continue on with that analogy, what's the sweetness of the gospel that makes it attractive everywhere? Let's turn the question. Why is Coca-Cola drunk everywhere? Well, because it's apparently refreshing and everybody drinks liquid and sugar's tasty, etc. Put those sorts of questions to this question of the spread of Christianity. Why did Christianity spread to the backwater of Pontus and Bithynia? And why is it already in Rome in 64 AD? What is Christianity that makes it attractive? Now, Rodney Stark does some amazing work here too, and I'm going to start with a point that he makes in this book that I've already mentioned to you. One of the reasons why Christianity spread is because of practical acts of charity, and specifically what Rodney Stark highlights that I haven't seen in other analyses, thought was very creative of him, is to speak of the way that Christianity spread when plague hit. There's a plague that occurred in the middle of the 3rd century throughout the Roman Empire. No one really knows what it was. Perhaps it was smallpox. We call the plague, I think it was in about 251 AD that the plague hits. We call the plague of Cyprian, not because Cyprian started it or got it, but Cyprian was a bishop, a Christian bishop in the city of Carthage, and he's writing a treatise on mortality and death and describes the symptoms of the plague. And so we've named it after this Christian bishop who took note of what was taking place in the bodies of those who were infected with this terrible disease. From his description, it may have been smallpox. Anyway, there's this terrible plague that ravages the empire. And let's listen to a couple descriptions that I'm going to give to you about this plague. We have this description. This is from Dionysius of Alexandria, writing this. And I think I actually have the text on a slide, so let me get that for you. No, I don't. I'm sorry. So I'll just have to read the text to you. Other people would not think this a time for festival, writes Dionysius, but they do not so regard this or any other time, even if so far as from being a time of distress, it is a time of unimaginable joy. Now, alas, all is lamentation, everyone is in mourning, and the city responds with weeping because of the number that have died and are dying every day. As Scripture says of the firstborn of the Egyptians, so there has now been a great cry. There is not a house in which there is not one dead. How I wish there had been only one. And in another passage that Dionysius continues, and I won't read it, actually I will, he describes here how Christians took it upon themselves to care for the physical needs of those who were suffering from this terrible illness. Listen to what Dionysius writes. He says, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of each other. Heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. For they were infected by others with a disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. Rodney Stark looks at this plague of Cyprian that occurs in the middle of the 3rd century and says it may have actually dramatically increased the Christian population in the Roman Empire, says our sociologist friend. Not only would basic nursing and care have prolonged the life of those who were sick, so you could do as the Romans were doing and abandon your relatives and so on if they were showing signs of sickness, and then they're certainly going to die, right? You ostracize people as soon as they become ill? Yeah, of course they're going to die. Or do you run the risk of actually taking on their illness but nurse them? And it seems that may have been in large numbers successful. So not only did that Christian population perhaps have a better survival rate, but those of the non-Christian groups, those of the pagans who had been nursed by Christians, don't you imagine that they would have been much more receptive to understanding what was the faith of these Christians that had motivated them to do these acts of charity? So could it have been, in fact, says Rodney Stark, a time of dramatic increase of conversions? Okay, why else did Christianity grow? What was Christianity doing that would have allowed for an attractiveness in its presentation to the gospel? Not just a preservation of life, but also an attractiveness to the Christian philosophy. And I have to tell you that when I was reading through those passages, I was reminded, too, of what's going on in Western Africa right now with Ebola virus. Sounds, in some ways, I wonder, if not quite similar there. Henry Chadwick, who was a prestigious church historian. I think he died in 2007 and held prestigious chairs at both Oxford and Cambridge University. He wrote a great little book entitled The Early Church. You can get it for just a few pennies if you get a used copy on Amazon from Penguin Books. And Henry Chadwick writes this. He says, the practical application of charity was probably the most potent single cause of Christian success, period. Let me read that again. The practical application of charity was probably the most potent single cause of Christian success. What do you think of that? In a moment, I'm going to break you into your groups or release you to be for a group discussion. I'm going to ask you to respond to that as a thought question. Do you agree or disagree with Chadwick? But let me give you a little bit more information to deal with before I release you to that exercise. Chadwick's idea is that Christian charity, or ministering to the needs of people around them, was the single most important reason for the spread of Christianity. It matches what the New Testament record calls Christians to do. It matches the first century Christian ethic of what should be happening. Look at Acts 6:1-7. Remember, in Acts 6, we have 7 men who were appointed to the position of the diaconate in the early church. What were the deacons meant to be doing? Well, they were overseeing and administering a Christian charity program. Really? Did it take 7 people to oversee that program? Was it that expansive and intricate that it took 7 administrators? We remember that Paul and Barnabas also had a heart for charity work. Remember? Paul and Barnabas, what's their first missionary journey? Not what we call the first missionary journey as it takes place in Acts 13, but where do we see Paul and Barnabas cooperating together and traveling on mission, on church business? What are they doing? Well, it's in Acts 11. They're traveling from Antioch down to Jerusalem to take funds to support the poor Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. And in Galatians 2, we remember Paul saying that the elders who received him in Jerusalem were eager to see that he continue administering to the needs of the poor, that he continue on in that. And Paul says, which we were eager to do. What is Paul doing in 1 Corinthians 16? Well, he's gathering up a collection for the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem from all the churches of Macedonia and Greece and those churches that he visits in Acts 16 and 17 on his second missionary journey. This is on Paul's heart. What do we read about James talking about in James 1:17? He says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. James 2:15, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says, go in peace and be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is it? So Chadwick's theory at least matches what the early Christian ethic was. How did that actually pan out beyond the first century? What indications do we see that this was continuing? Well, let me read to you a couple quotes. Keep your ears perked, because I'm going to release you to your group work in just a moment. But here's a little more data to play with in your discussions. So we see this depiction in the first century of this large Christian program of charity. What happens after the first century? It seems that it continues to expand. Listen to what Dionysius of Corinth writes when he's writing back to the Roman church in the middle of the 2nd century. He writes this: from Corinth to Rome, middle of the 2nd century. From the start, it has been your custom to treat all Christians with unfailing kindness and to send contributions to many churches in every city, sometimes alleviating the distress of those in need, sometimes providing for your brothers in the mines by the contributions you have sent from the start. Thus, you Romans have observed the ancestral Roman custom, which your reverend Bishop Soter has not only maintained but enlarged by generously providing the abundant supplies distributed among God's people and by encouraging with inspired words fellow Christians who come to the city as an affectionate father encourages his children. I'm going to read, at least one more quote to you, possibly two, that speak about Christian charity in the early years. This is from Tertullian, so this takes us now to North Africa. Can you show us on the map where Carthage is, please, Palmer? That would be wonderful. We're going to travel to look at Tertullian, who's the first Latin writer in Christian antiquity. He writes at the end of the 2nd century, sometime after about 180 AD, something like that, 180, 190, 200 AD. And he's writing in his Apology, which was one of his earlier works. He writes this: though we have a treasure chest, it is not made up of purchase money as a religion that has its price. So in other words, yes, we keep a collection, but it's not, you don't subscribe to being a Christian and pay a monthly donation. It's a different use, says Tertullian. If the individual likes, each puts in a small donation, but only if it be his pleasure, and only if he is able, for there is no compulsion, all is voluntary. These gifts are, as it were, piety's deposit fund, for they are not taken thence and spent on feasts and drinking bouts and eating houses, but to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of boys and girls destitute of means and parents, and of old persons confined now to the house, such too as have suffered shipwreck. And if there happen to be any in the mines, or banished to the islands, or shut up in the prisons, for nothing but their fidelity to the cause of God's church, they become the nurslings of their confession. In other words, the church will take care of them if they're in the mines because they've confessed to be Christians. But it is mainly the deeds of love so noble that lead many to put a brand on us. See, they say, how they love one another. And I could read another quote or two, but I won't. That's enough information for you to get to work. I want you to wrestle with that. So this is the first of the group work that I've been releasing you to do. Here's what I want from you. I'm only going to give you 8 minutes because we've already had one group exercise. I'm just going to give you 8 minutes for this. This is not a long time period, so you'll have to work quickly. In that time, you already know who your groups are. Circle around so you can converse. Have one of you prepare an email that you'll send into my account, jonathan.armstrong@moody.edu. Here are the things that I want in that email. Give me, well, I'll have your name, so that's fine, but give me your group number. Give me the thesis in response to the question, and I'll put the prompt up on the board here. And then 2, give me arguments, and I need 3 of them. So give me a 1, give me a 2, and give me a 3 argument at least in reply to your thesis. The prompt that I would like you to respond to is this. Do you agree or disagree with Chad? The application for the success of Christianity in the, I'm going to say in the pre-Constantinian era, okay? In the pre-Constantinian era. I've given you an easy one to start with. It's easy in as much as the question is a yes or no. I want to be gentle with you. Later on in the class, I'll ask you very open-ended questions. You'll have to write your thesis. You'll have to craft it more carefully. But this is agree or disagree and why. I'll give you 8 minutes to do that. Thank you. Class, as you prepare your emails, could I also ask you to give me a list of names of who's present? Because I can already see in your groups that we have a lot of people who are absent. So just tell me who's there, present, and here's our response. Thanks. Class, I'm so sorry to interrupt your conversations. Actually, those of you who are being secretaries, can you format this on a Word document? Because what I'll do, it'll be much more convenient for me to actually keep this in a file for your group. That'll be much quicker for me to organize. So just send me a Word document. Again, names, thesis, arguments. Thanks. Hit send! Hit send! It's like the scene at the end of Mission Impossible 1 where they're trying to get that email to transmit as they're coming through the tunnel. Do it quick! All right, so I'll look forward to reading your answers. And thanks for sending them to me as Word documents so that I can quickly file them. At the end of the semester, we can look and see how many times that guy was late on your, or absent from your group, and we'll figure out what to do about that. All right, let me, we've got just 14 minutes, and we need a little time for a quiz as well, so let me give you just a tiny, tiny piece on the fourth missionary journey of Paul, and Palmer will have a quiz for you, and that's all we'll get done today. Let me talk to you about the 4 missionary journeys of Paul. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, 4 missionary journeys of Paul? I only thought that Paul took 3 missionary journeys. That's what I learned in Sunday school. Paul's first missionary journey, so we speak of, is in Acts 13. He travels where? Well, remember he set off from Antioch and he goes through Cyprus. It's in Cyprus that Paul starts taking on that name of Paul. At least Luke the evangelist previous to this time always refers to Paul as Saul. And then after the conversion of Paulus Sergius, this famous convert that the Apostle Paul wins to Christianity, after that time Luke the evangelist starts referring to the apostle as Paul. Did Paul take on the name of his convert? I don't know. Anyway, they go up to Perga. This is where John Mark abandons the team. He heads back to Jerusalem. The team goes up into what's left of the team. Barnabas and Paul go up through Galatia. Paul faces this terrible incident in Lystra where he's nearly stoned to death. That sort of brings a conclusion to the first missionary journey, and they beat a retreat back to Antioch in the days ahead. Paul's nursed back to health back in Antioch. The second missionary journey of Paul, you can see the scripture references there in Acts 15:36 and following through to 18:22. This is the most famous, probably, of Paul's missionary journeys. This is the one where he travels back through the churches. Travels back through the churches in Galatia after the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. Paul heads back. Paul and Barnabas are, first of all, divided. Why, again, are they divided? Because John Mark bailed on them, and Paul doesn't want John Mark to come back on this team. Barnabas, however, who's cousins with John Mark, is much more sympathetic to the young man. Says, no, we'll go back to Cyprus. Barnabas, you remember, actually comes from Cyprus. This is his home island. So he and John Mark return back to Cyprus. Paul goes on a different route. Paul's kind of lacking vision at this point. It's an odd moment for Paul. Paul seems to always have everything together, but no, he too is lacking vision at this time. He goes back to the churches in Galatia that he had previously ministered to in his first missionary journey, but after that, he doesn't really know what he's doing. The scripture tells us, and this is in the middle of Acts 16, the scriptures tell us that he's trying to get to Asia, and we can read into that, Paul's trying to get to Ephesus, second largest city, or is about the second largest city in the empire. Antioch, Alexandria, these are other very large cities as well. But it's one of the larger cities in the Roman Empire at this time, and Paul has this things for large cities as centers of ministry. So he's trying to get to Ephesus, but the Holy Spirit forbids him. He wants to go up to Bithynia. The Holy Spirit forbids him to do that too. So he basically wanders aimlessly to Troas. What's Troas? Little hoedown town of a tiny little population, a little port city. Paul has no idea what he's doing here. The really beautiful thing is that while Paul has no idea why he arrived in Troas, it does seem to be that this is where he meets Luke. This is where the famous we passages in Scripture begin. If you're familiar with that, this is where Luke the evangelist begins the narrative with first person plural, we, instead of speaking of third person singular and plural, they did this, he did this, and so on. So it seems that this is probably where Paul meets Luke. And I just love that because in times of lack of vision, maybe God's building your team. He's either building your team or he's taking you places. But where he's not taking you places, he might be building you your team. What else do you think you're doing here in Spokane? Good. All right, so Paul regains a sense of vision. He heads up to Neapolis. This is where he has this Macedonian vision. God calls in this dream, sends this dream where Paul sees this Macedonian saying, come over and help us. So Paul feels like he's back on rails again, goes over to Neapolis, Philippi, and down the Grecian coast here. Spends some real time in Corinth. He's there for about 18 months. He does make it to Ephesus on the way back from his second missionary journey, goes back to Jerusalem and so on. Okay, that's the second missionary journey. Third missionary journey. And by the way, why am I telling you all this? This is stuff that may have been covered in your New Testament class. It's entirely pertinent to understanding the spread of Christianity. Paul is our single best example of how we know Christian missionary activity operated. Now, no doubt Paul was something of a pioneer, an anomaly, if you will, a unique case, but not an entirely unique case. If you were to count out all of Paul's missionary associates that we just read about in the letters of the New Testament and so on, how many do you think that would total? How many people in his epistles and in Acts does Paul address as my fellow worker, my fellow yokesman, etc.? a fellow minister in the gospel. How many people work alongside and with Paul? Give me a guess. Go ahead, Marcus. Yes, about 32 or 34, something like that. Right. This is a group of several dozen people, even in Paul's own missionary operation, who are doing this. We think of Paul as this pioneer. Well, and no doubt he was, but he's also basically running a mini mission agency. There's like 3 dozen people doing this, okay? It's not just Paul. And many of them, too. I mean, Barnabas is traveling over to Cyprus and so on. John Mark, who seemed to have cold feet at the beginning of this journey, he's going to go over as far as Rome. That's like off the map here that I'm showing you because it's so far to the west. John Mark is going to end up in Rome when he's working with Peter. And then according to tradition, he's going to go down to Alexandria. This is cold-footed John Mark. He's going to be like bouncing all over the empire as well. So Paul's missionary journeys were well recorded for us, and he was an inspiration to others, but he was not the only person doing this by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, he's a great window into helping us understand how missionary activity operated in the first century. And we can only understand that it expanded from there as well. Now, before Paul's so-called fourth missionary journey, the book of Acts ends with Paul in Rome, imprisoned. He travels up here through, this is showing the journey to Rome where he's imprisoned in somewhere around 60, 62 AD, something like that. And that's where the book of Acts ends. Let me present to you all super quickly the hypothesis that this may not have actually been the end of Paul's days. Paul may have taken a so-called, we could call it a fourth missionary journey. In other words, Paul may have been released after the book of Acts ended, and he may have continued doing missionary work. And for all of the way that this fits into this class here, I'm just trying to illustrate how first century missionary activity operated. What happens to Paul after the book of Acts closes? Well, we know that Paul desperately wanted to get to Spain. This was Paul's big missionary activity. And did he make it? Well, maybe. If you read Romans 15:23 to 24, you see that this is Paul's big idea. The way that the New Testament closes, Paul has this grand vision of bringing the gospel all the way to Spain. What is he trying to do? He probably is trying to finish the spread of the gospel, all in the first century. He's writing his epistle to the Romans, it seems, because he's ramping up for his biggest missionary activity ever, trying to put together a team that can speak Latin and do things that he can't, trying to get the gospel all the way to Spain, which was then conceived to be the end of the world. They, of course, hadn't discovered North and South America at this point of time, so what they call the Pillars of Hercules, those huge rocks out of the coast of Spain, those were the Pillars of Hercules. That's where Hercules is holding up the earth, because nothing else is after that. Paul is trying to get to Spain. Did he make it? Well, early church tradition seems to think that he did. First Clement gives us a clue. It says, and Clement was somebody who probably knew Paul, writing just a generation afterwards. Clement says that Paul came to the extreme limit of the West. That's Spain, folks, if Clement is right. The Muratorian fragment, too, whether by reported tradition or simply by reading the book of Romans, we don't know, but the author of the Muratorian fragment seems to think that Paul did get to Spain. That's in the indicative case, indicative mood there. What actual evidence do we have for the fourth missionary journey of Paul? Well, I'm going to cut to the chase, only a little bit. If you read 2 Timothy 4:16 to 17, and I'm following a reading put together by Eusebius, the father of church history, it seems that Paul was released. Here what we have, this is a bit of intelligence from the very last document that Paul wrote. He writes, "At my first defense, no one came to stand by me." Now wait a minute, you don't talk about a first defense unless there's a second defense in view. You don't talk about your first marriage if it's your only marriage, okay? Paul's talking about his first defense here. So did he have a second defense, or is he awaiting a second defense? "No one came to stand by me, but all deserted me." Whoops, excuse me. Okay. "All deserted me. May it not be charged against them." And this would also explain why the book of Acts ends where it does, because Luke was not with Paul during his first defense. "But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me." So the first defense, what Paul is anticipating standing before the emperor at the end of Acts, he reports here potentially as "the Lord strengthened me." In other words, there was a good outcome. I survived it. So that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. Fully proclaimed. That's the question. What does Paul mean there by fully proclaimed? We know it was his ambition to get to Spain. Did he make it? So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. Eusebius says he's talking, here Paul is talking about Nero, the lion's mouth. He was rescued. I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever. Amen. But at this point in Paul's ministry, he's not anticipating release, is he? He's expecting entrance into the kingdom of heaven. The way that the early church fathers read this text, and specifically Eusebius of Caesarea, it does seem that Paul was released after the book of Acts closed. Did he make it to Spain? We've got a couple clues suggesting he did. No hard evidence. But anyway, Paul is our best window into understanding how missionary activity worked in the first century. Marcus, just because of time, let's chat right after class. Palmer, can I have you administer our final quiz, and then you'll be dismissed.
Okay, everybody in Blackboard kind of know the drill. Getting the hang of this. Quiz 2 should be the only one open right now, so you shouldn't have any problems with opening something that you're not supposed to. And because of time constraints, I'm just going to go ahead. Cool. Question 1. When did Christianity become the official religion of the Roman Empire? A. In 380 AD under Theodosius I. B. In 249 AD under Decius. C. In 286 AD under Diocletian. D. In 313 AD under Constantine. Or E. In 54 AD under Nero. Question 2. This is a bit of a long one. How does Luke's account of the growth of Christianity in Acts differ from Rodney Stark's estimates? A. Luke records that the Christians stayed in one locality for at least the first decade after Christ's ascension. B. Luke records a much slower growth rate in the first decade of Christianity than Stark's estimates. C. Luke records a much faster growth rate in the first decade of Christianity than Stark's estimates. D. Luke records that Christians made up the majority of the population of the Roman Empire within the first decade after Christ's ascension. Or E. Luke's account and Stark's estimates agree on all essential facts. I'll leave this one up for a second because it's a bit longer. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Question 3. According to the lecture, which pagan authors tell us something about the spread of early Christianity? Is it A. Herodotus and Socrates of Constantinople? B. Marcus Aurelius and Julius Caesar? C. Cornelius Tacitus and Pliny the Younger? D. Eusebius of Caesarea and Cornelius Tacitus? Or E. Marcus Aurelius and Dionysius of Alexandria? Moving on. Question 4. This should be a gimme. According to Henry Chadwick, what was, quote, the most potent single cause of Christian success, end quote, in the pre-Constantinian era? Was it A, the practical application of Christian charity, B, the Pax Romana, C, the intellectual strength of Christianity, D, the Jewish diaspora, or E, the persecution of Christians? And question 5. What was the destination of the fourth missionary journey of Paul? Was it A, Ephesus, B, Corinth, C, Cyprus, D, Spain, or E, Troas? And that's the quiz.
You're all dismissed. Thanks so much. Enjoy your morning. Oh, yes. What happens now?
They're having a speaker.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, great.
I sent you an email letting you know I didn't realize we were supposed to pop into the class.
Okay.
So I can pop into their first class.
Okay, have we talked about that before? I'm just trying to remember. Is this follow up on a previous conversation?
No.
No, okay.
I just sent you an email like
Okay.
probably like last weekend.
Okay.
What I have to do is like